Hello, everyone. Margie here to present on Gloria Anzaldúa's essay, La Conciencia de la Mestiza, Towards a New Consciousness. I've titled this presentation, Una Conciencia de Mujer, Pliability and Impurity in the Borderlands, because I want to focus on the movement and changeability of the mestiza and the possibilities this presents to Anzaldúa. Likewise, I think it is equally important to keep in mind the underlying gender presuppositions that Anzaldúa carries at the bedrock of her argument for a new mestiza consciousness. There is fluidity in the borderlands, where the mestiza reside, which is represented by womanhood as pliable, as transformative, and not fixed. This also works into the idea of impurity as resistance that I will discuss in a bit. So first, I'll begin by briefly going over the key points of Anzaldúa's essay. Then I'm going to situate her text alongside Glissant and another theorist we are reading later in the semester, María Lugones. Lugones' work to me is very influential, and I think aside from this presentation kind of serving as a bit of an introduction to her theory, her ideas also work to connect Anzaldúa to Glissant, to mediate between the two when they seem disjointed. And finally, we'll take a look at a few points to be wary of or excited about in Anzaldúa's work. And this too, I am eager to hear your points about in class tomorrow. So to quickly summarize, to Anzaldúa, a reframing or a new consciousness of the mestiza will include the following components. First, it will be at its core a new way of thinking about images and symbols. She writes on page 103, I am cultured because I am participating in the creation of yet another mestiza culture, a new story to explain the world and our participation in it, a new value system with images and symbols that connect us to each other and the planet. So she aims to write in ways that defy definitions of, for example, lightness and darkness, to give them new meanings that are not constricted to binaric formulations, to break down paradigms. By creating a new mythos, she says on page 102, La Mestiza creates a new consciousness. So we change the way we see ourselves and the ways we perceive reality. It is a shifting. Secondly, a woman's consciousness is the structure that defines the borderlands to Anzaldúa. Women already experience both liminality and limitation because of the harsh confines of the world's heteropatriarchal organization. So the space of this consciousness appears to be inherently feminine. The patriarchal structures of masculinity hinder flexibility, the machismo kind of trope that she was discussing, which is why the new consciousness cannot be cisgender male based or centered. As we mentioned last week, this is very similar to Césaire's notion of l'emplante. Womanhood is malleable yet unbreakable. There's also a notion that mestiza people ought to be able to cross over and communicate with and through their different cultures or races. The mestiza ought to be able to transcend or live in or on this line between identity classifications. And this is an idea we will return to later. So the goal then of the new consciousness in all is really to heal. Anzaldúa spends a lot of time describing the psychological turmoil of the mestiza, which we will also come back to at the end. She emphasizes that the uprooting of dualistic thinking, an apology from those who are ignorant of this idea as well, oddly enough, will help to recover the psyche and the soul of the mestiza. To make this point clear, she says on page 109, the struggle has always been inner and is played out in the outer terrains. I also wanted to highlight this poem by Gina Valdez, which Anzaldúa cites to drive her point about crossing over home. The poem reads in English, there are so many borders that divide people, but for every border, there is also a bridge. And I'm curious to know if that is an accurate translation. But in all, Anzaldúa seems to think that the mestiza is that bridge. So now I'd like to discuss María Lugones. To me, I find Lugones a clear mediator between creolization and mestiza, at least in the ways Anzaldúa defines mestiza. Lugones more often uses mestizaje, which, at least to my limited knowledge, has a bit more of a positive connotation associated with it in Latin America, though correct me if I'm wrong there. But even more than mestizaje, overall she uses the terms multiplicity and multiplicitous to describe mixed identities as really like intermeshed. She thinks about mestizaje or multiplicity in terms of action and creativity rather than the essence of the mestiza. or formulating a new framework in how we see or orient things. She's much more straightforward in tackling the illogic of dichotomies, how separation into pure parts is impossible, and how when people do this, it's really an attempt to control or make sense of something that doesn't seem to make sense with the mestiza, as components to their identities often seem paradoxical or contradictory, but in reality, of course, are not. So just to give a brief overview, in her book, Pilgrimages, Peregrinajes, which is my main source material, the logic of pluralism or impure separation is conceptually at odds with the logic, or I like to say illogic, of purity. So briefly, the logic of purity, or purely separating mixed people's identities, reduces them to sets of dichotomies. It's really a way for the dominant group to retain control and to suppress. But the logic of pluralism, or impure separation, states that the multiplicitous subject cannot be cut up into binaries. This could be something like choosing a side, or a race or culture, even what cause to fight for, or it could take the form of suppressing our queerness in homophobic spaces and things like that, because their identities combat the inherent essentialism within fragmented groups. She says, to cut me up would be the death of myself as multiplicitous. So in reducing one's identity to one thing versus the other thing or things, we basically cease to exist. And I also want to note that she uses impurity as a word that is rebellious, one that inspires insurrection and difference rather than conformity. Intermeshed identities are impure, which is to say they're never entirely separable. It's not to be taken to mean like anything bad, which maybe the word would connotate on its own, or connote on its own. And then lastly, the art of curdling is a really interesting theme that she explores in her writing. Curdling here is the verb she uses in likening multiplicitous identity to oil and water emulsions, which is to say that parts of the identity don't become invisible after mixing with each other, but instead each part is still obviously present, though not discrete. So the art of curdling then just means that the multiplicitous individual has the ability to traverse the different aspects of their identity. There are no hard borders within her, though there are clearly multiple, plural components to her identity. She is wholly all of these components. So this art then is set up like an experimental way of resisting the cutting up of one's identity into discrete pieces, denying the oppressor's logic of purity and of dichotomization through writing, through art, protesting, and so on. So making the case for the multiple, for plurality of experiences within a group. And this connects to Glissant's theory of creolization well, because Lugones isn't concerned about our state as multiplicitous beings necessarily. She is really insistent instead on our activity and our movement, the ways we engage with groups and tear down essentialist notions of race, ethnicity, sexuality, and gender. And to finish up discussing Lugones, I just wanted to read one of the many excellent excerpts from her book. She writes, "It is the impulse to reject dichotomies and to live and embody that rejection that gives us some hope of standing together as people who recognize each other in our complexity." And now to transition to Glissant, I just want to accent his idea that creolization is a state of becoming. So he writes, "Creolizations, one of the ways of forming a complex mix and not merely a linguistic result, is only exemplified by its processes. We propose neither humanity's being nor its models. We are not prompted solely by the defining of our identities, but by their relation to everything possible as well." I think this idea relates to Lugones' idea of creativity and Anzaldúa's notion of potential for the mestiza. Glissant does not want to limit creolization to creolness. He wants to imagine its continuity. Lugones exemplifies this through her idea that we exist rebelliously when we defy dichotomies or pure conventions, and we ought to keep doing this. And then Anzaldúa to me seems at once stuck in thinking about mestiza-ness while also insisting that the mestiza needs to persist in crossing borders to dismantle binaries that are harmful to the psyche. So while Anzaldúa and Glissant don't align completely, there is a sense of pushing or a forward motion that lies somewhere in both of their theories. I also think it's important to remember where Glissant was physically situated in the world as opposed to Anzaldúa. Glissant resided on an island. Martinique carries with it a sense of isolation, but Anzaldúa is literally sat on a border. She can so obviously, so tangibly see and even cross over to encounter, both sides of her identity. So there is a separability in Anzaldúa inherent in her border crossing schema that Glissant does not reach because he cannot physically get there. He has to formulate a new idea about mixed identity through the body, the linguistic, non-history, and through landscape. So some things to wonder about when it comes to Anzaldúa's writing are her essentialist modes underlying a lot of her ideas. While there is much to celebrate about her work, I found myself a bit disconcerted by the reification of race and culture and even genetics at times when she is arguing to dismantle those boundaries anyway. But the idea of border crossing to me carries with it this idea that there is a place you can go and a place you can return to, therefore they are separate. But as we've seen in the body and for Glissant in language and landscape, this is not possible. This is something Lugones addresses more effectively in her theory by conceptualizing mestizaje as intermeshed. Another thing I wonder about is her psychological undertone. She spends a lot of time talking about how the mestiza feels, about evolution and about our souls, which again only seems to reify the notion that there is a separate, discrete, pure soul to be had by the mestiza. There is a way the mestiza ought to live, a state in which to reside. It made me recall Du Bois's double consciousness, of course, where his two warring ideals or strivings notion is essentialist in itself. I am still a bit unclear as to whether Anzaldúa is applying this consciousness to be reserved for the mestiza or to be adopted by everyone at large. It's a weird question, but it's intriguing to me because on the one hand, yes, the essay is called The Consciousness of the Mestiza. So I'm inclined to think she is thinking it's the former, that this is a healing mission and that the mestiza ought to take on this new consciousness and deconstruct binaric paradigms for others. And that they and the mestizo are the only ones able to inhabit this space of in-betweenness. But it has a tinge of at-largeness, and likewise begs the question of whether there is an idealized consciousness to be had by the mestiza. So Anzaldúa seems to suppose that this is the mestiza's duty, our essence, to be the border crosser, to bear this burden, to be an example of possibility. And anytime a type of person is thought to be held up as a pinnacle of an experience, that has the danger of wandering into essentialist territory again. And she says, nuestra alma al trabajo, which literally translates to our soul work. At least that is what the internet provided me. If there's another kind of way that could be interpreted, I'd be really curious to know. So that just kind of lit off alarms in my mind when I read that. But another theorist who addresses this directly is Linda Alcoff, who says that this border crossing method structures the crossing so that mestiza becomes a sort of Pocahontas figure who is serving the oppressor, really, navigating back and forth for the oppressor's benefit so that they can understand. But this really goes against the central argument of Anzaldúa's essay we read last week, which was How to Tame a Wild Tongue, where we ought not do the work of translation because that would mean we are still working for you. So it seems like in attempting to, one, clarify and alleviate the weight the mestiza feels mentally, and two, restructure the ways we orient ourselves along a binary, Anzaldúa is conflating what we can do to heal with the presupposed responsibility of the mestiza body or agent. So in general, there's much to admire about Anzaldúa when she says things like, rigidity means death, or I've encountered a few scattered and isolated gentle straight men, but they are confused, and much more. There are, however, at least in my reading, apparent contradictions in what she aims and what she ends up actually suggesting. And to finish up, I have some discussion questions here that I'm interested to hear your thoughts on. What struck me while reading Anzaldúa was all the assumptions on which she founded a mestiza consciousness, and also the ways she saw revolution or progress. Sometimes I was very inspired by her words, and other times I was honestly a bit disturbed by them. Of course, this was written 30, 40 years ago. So our language has changed significantly, but particularly the language of breeding did not sit well with me. There's a lot of animalistic language that felt odd to read. So yes, let me know what you think. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to our discussion tomorrow. Thank you so much.